Welcome, everyone, ready to dive deep into sacred geometry, always ready to explore these fascinating patterns. Today, we're zeroing in on one that's said to be the blueprint for, well, everything the flower of life. It's a big one, for sure. Where do you even begin with something so vast? Well, our source material starts with this idea of spirit expanding its consciousness. Right, it's in this void, and it creates a sphere around itself, the first circle in the pattern, and then it just keeps going, right, moving to the edge of that sphere and making another, and another exactly like steps in the expansion of consciousness. Each one reveals more knowledge, like those mathematical proportions we see encoded in the pattern. And there are even parallels drawn between this and the biblical creation story. Something about how those days of creation line up with the formation of the circles. You got it? That first movement of spirit creates light, just like it says in Genesis, "Let there be light." But it's not just a biblical thing. Ancient Egyptians also had this idea of creation emerging from a void. But they were also keen on pointing out that for motion to exist, you need something to measure it against. Like, you can't just have pure motion in an empty void. It needs a reference point. Makes you wonder if even nothingness is more complex than we think. It's a real head-scratcher. But getting back to the pattern itself, this expanding consciousness eventually forms what's called the seed of life. Yeah, you got it, the seed of life, or the Genesis pattern, formed from those first 7 circles. But it keeps unfolding. It does, revealing even more complex shapes, like the tree of life. We often hear about it in the context of the Kabbalah, but it's way older than that. It shows up across cultures throughout history, like those ancient Egyptian pillars at Karnak. Talk about a symbol that spans millennia. And here's where it gets really interesting. The source connects the tree of life to the Vesica Piscis. Every circle in the tree of life actually aligns perfectly with the dimensions of the Vesica Piscis, like they're all interwoven, building on each other to create something even greater. And speaking of building, that leads us to the egg of life, another fascinating shape that comes from the flower of life. The egg of life, fill me in. What's so special about it? Well, it's 3-dimensional. It's formed from 7 spheres arranged in a very specific way. And get this, it's believed to be the blueprint for the human body. Whoa, hold on. Are you saying our bodies are formed from this geometric pattern? I'm literally made of sacred geometry. That's the idea. Every physical aspect of us, from our eye color to our bone structure, supposedly stems from this pattern. Raises a ton of questions, doesn't it? I mean, if this is how our bodies are formed, what does that say about our health, our emotions, even our consciousness? So much to unpack there. But before we go down that rabbit hole, I'm curious about another term I keep seeing, the fruit of life. What's the deal with that one? What's so special about this forbidden fruit of geometry? Well, it's the key to another incredibly powerful pattern, Metatron's cube. You connect the centers of all the circles within the fruit of life with straight lines and bam, Metatron's cube. It does have a kind of mythical ring to it. Why is it so important in sacred geometry? Because it contains all 5 Platonic solids. Okay, those I remember from geometry class. But how do they fit into all of this? What makes the Platonic solids so special is their perfect symmetry. They're the only 3D shapes where all the sides and angles are equal, which is why they were seen as the building blocks of the universe. So these perfectly symmetrical shapes are all contained within Metatron's cube, which comes from the fruit of life, which is hidden within the flower of life. It's like a cosmic Russian nesting doll. That's a great way to put it. And to make it even more intriguing, each Platonic solid is associated with a classical element. Wait, like earth, air, fire, and water. What do those have to do with geometry? Each shape embodies specific qualities that align with its corresponding element, like the tetrahedron. For example, it's got that sharp, pointed structure. So, it's associated with fire. Fire tetrahedron. Okay, I see it. Fire is all about energy, transformation, passion. It makes sense that it would be linked to a shape that feels so dynamic. And then you have the cube super grounded and stable, associated with Earth, representing stability, foundation, the physical world. So fire and earth tetrahedron and cube. I'm seeing the pattern here. What about the other elements? So, the octahedron has a light, airy structure. Makes sense that it's associated with air, representing things like intellect, communication, ideas floating around. And then the icosahedron, with its flowing, interconnected structure, represents water, all about emotions, intuition, the subconscious. You got it? Okay, so that just leaves one more element and Platonic solid. The dodecahedron. It's the most complex of the Platonic solids, and it's associated with ether, representing spirit, consciousness, the interconnectedness of everything. Ether, the mysterious fifth element. The dodecahedron sounds like a pretty special shape. The ancient Pythagorean school thought so. It was so sacred to them that they wouldn't even say its name outside their inner circle. A shape so powerful it had to be kept secret. That's pretty intense. But how does all this ancient wisdom relate to modern science? Do scientists even care about these shapes anymore? In fact, science is rediscovering the principles of sacred geometry in some really fascinating ways. Like how? Well, like we mentioned earlier, Professor Robert Moon, a researcher at the University of Chicago, showed that the whole periodic table, all the elements that make up the physical world, are based on those 5 Platonic solids. No way. You're telling me that the building blocks of matter are based on these ancient shapes? So, it's not just mystical mumbo-jumbo, there's actual science to back it up. And it's not just in chemistry, either. You see these patterns popping up in physics, biology. It suggests that these ancient patterns are still super relevant today. That's wild. We're not just talking about cool shapes, we're talking about fundamental principles that govern how the universe works. It all points to the idea that the universe ain't random or chaotic. There's an order to it, a harmony, a blueprint that guides how everything unfolds. And that blueprint is written in the language of sacred geometry. And if we learn to read that language, who knows what incredible discoveries we might make. Well, this deep dive has definitely changed how I see things. I'm starting to notice these patterns everywhere in nature, art, even just how people interact. It's amazing, isn't it? Once you start paying attention, you see sacred geometry woven into everything, like the universe is speaking to us in this secret language, and we're finally starting to understand. So, zooming out even further, what does all this tell us about reality itself? That's the big question, isn't it? And while we may never have all the answers, sacred geometry gives us some pretty interesting clues. It suggests that there's an order to things, a blueprint, a code that governs how the universe unfolds. It's not just random.